Hi, hello, witam, welcome. Welcome to MyLondyn. I'm Jola and this is the place where we explore Polish arts and culture here in London. Today, my guest is Roger Moorhouse. We're meeting up online ahead of his book talk at Ognisko Polskie. And the book that he's going to talk about is The Devil's Alliance, Hitler's Pact with Stalin, 1939 to 1940. I'm just going to introduce you to Roger, and that's the book there. Meticulous, vividly readable, grim and compelling book. Could not be more topical. That's one of the things we're going to explore today. I was absolutely thrilled when Roger said that he could meet me today here online. He studied history and politics at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at the University of London, early 1990s. And then he studied at Dusseldorf and Strathclyde, and he began his writing career working for Professor Norman Davies, and he collaborated with him on many of the recent publications, including Europe, a History, The Isles, a History, and Rising 44, and co-authored Microcosm. Now, this was the book that Święty Mikołaj, Father Christmas, was very kind in giving to me. And it's the first time I thought, oh, who's that? Roger Moorhouse, who is that? Because at the time, Norman Davies, absolutely in awe of the work that he's doing in explaining Polish history and bringing that to an English audience. And this book absolutely gripped me because the writing is just not like a history book. It's vibrant, it's relatable, and what's really clever about this is it's following one city, Breslau, which is modern Wrocław, from AD 1000 all through its history, and it really is the history of Europe in this one city. Really, really fantastic book. In 2020, Roger's work was applauded, thanked, when he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit to the Republic of Poland for promoting this greater understanding of Polish history abroad. And the book that every day on Twitter, I have to say, somebody comments about this book or tweets about it, First to Fight. And this is the forgotten story of the Second World War, something very, very close to Poles living in London, Poles in Poland, but Poles living in London who kind of just really felt forgotten about, not understood. And this book really just explained this German-Soviet invasion of Poland and really detailed the brutality of the opening campaign of the Second World War, tackling the mythology, and also assessing the role of Britain and France in the conflict. Other books by Roger, Berlin at War, Third Reich, really fascinating way of approaching history. I mean, this is what really excites me about reading one of Roger's books, is he'll take a subject and then present it in a really clever way. And I think the Third Reich in 100 Objects was just fascinating. It really brought it to life. And it was something that I was very, very uncomfortable reading about. And through the objects, I found that I was able to be much more objective in my reaction to what he was talking about. And here we have Devil's Alliance. So let me introduce my guest. I have introduced my guest. Welcome, my guest, Roger. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming today online.
That was a wonderful introduction. I must get you to do all of my introductions from now on.
Oh, you're very kind, Roger. It's very easy when somebody has done so much amazing work like you've done, and promoted the Polish history in England.
Well, it's something I'm have been quite passionate about. It was Poland that effectively persuaded me emotionally to go to university when I did, and to go to the university that I went to. It was the experience of sitting on my sofa watching 1989 unfold, and that whole sort of narrative. Primarily, in my mind, it was still, you know, synonymous with l'effervescence and solidarity. And it's that motivated me to want to go and find out more about Poland. And I still have the same fascination now as I did 30 years ago. So you know, it's a love affair that doesn't let me go, unfortunately.
Good. We've actually got a comment here from James McNeil. First to fight is first class.
Wonderful. Thank you, James.
Thank you. And that is the kind of comments you hear nearly every day on Twitter.
I know, people are very kind about them, and particularly that book. It's a funny situation when you write for a living, and I have now, I think, 7 books written. I think the 7th being my book on the Ładoś group, which isn't out yet. But you do, to some extent, you don't know how they're going to be received, and to some extent it's a little bit over dramatizing it to say, you know, you don't know if it's going to be any good, because I think you do kind of know that it's pretty good, but you don't know how it's going to be received. And to be well received, and to have people saying, oh, you know, I love that book, and you know, it taught me so much, and so on. It's such a lovely thing to hear. Genuinely, it really is. It's, you know, we don't just sort of sit there and take that in our stride as authors and historians. It really does mean a lot.
Oh, wonderful. And of course, you know, we're meeting today, but on Wednesday you'll be at Ognisko Polskie.
Indeed.
Talking. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Which is somewhere I don't think, I was racking my brain, I don't think I've ever actually spoken there. I've been to presentations there before. I've been to lectures there, and I've been there for dinner many times, of course, as everybody should. But I don't think I've ever actually given a talk there. So I think this is a first, and I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Oh, well, we're honoured, and you know, anyone who can make it, tickets are still available. Just go to the Ognisko Polskie website /events. We'll find you there. So just coming onto this book that we're talking about, which is Devil's Alliance. What is the Devil's Alliance? And, you know, what was actually your motivation for exploring the Nazi-Soviet Pact?
Well, the Devil's Alliance itself is shorthand for this strategic alignment, we can call it, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in this period between 1939 and 41. I should stress in advance, before you get lots of sort of green ink messages at the bottom of the screen, that it wasn't a formal alliance. It never was. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, which is essentially the kickoff for this relationship, shall we say, between Moscow and Berlin, is not a treaty of alliance. It's a treaty of non-aggression, essentially, but it has within it this famous secret protocol, which essentially means delineates the line upon which, you know, Moscow and Berlin will divide Central Europe between them, as they put it at the time, in the event of a territorial reorganization. And that territorial reorganization is the war that breaks out on the 1st of September with the German invasion. So they are sort of, it's an essential sort of precondition, effectively, for World War II happening in the way that it did, which we'll come on to in a minute. Mm-hmm. So the Devil's Alliance, crucially for those who are, and I point this as much towards native Brits as Poles, but if you look at the title, it's Devils plural, it's Devils S apostrophe, 2 devils, not just 1 devil. And I think this is a crucial point that I often sort of bang on about, particularly at the moment. But when we're talking about this early period of the war, we have to acknowledge, and this is pointing the finger mainly at the Western narrative, we have to acknowledge that there are 2 villains, there are 2 devils in European history at this point, Hitler and Stalin. The Western narrative has a very sort of peculiar, myopic viewpoint towards Stalin. It sort of sees Stalin at this point as essentially as an ally in waiting. You know, they're waiting for Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, the German invasion, and then Stalin will fall into the camp of the Grand Alliance, which he does. But viewing him in that way and accepting the fiction that he's a neutral in 1939-40, because that's what he proclaimed the Soviet Union to be, accepting that fiction completely means that the Western narrative completely misunderstands the first 2 years of the war, which is a period in which, you know, which is dominated by that very strategic and economic alliance or alignment between Germany and the Soviet Union. And if we can't see that, we have to change our perspective to see those two villains, those two devils acting side by side. So hence the title, The Devil's Alliance, Two Devils in Alliance. Why did I write it? Well, the first thing to say on that is that I have, as a historian, I have a sort of a horror of writing things about subjects that everyone already knows about. Writing, for example, I always use the example of the Dam Busters raid, which, as I'm sure you know, Jola, kind of looms large in the British historiography of the war. A great example of British pluck and ingenuity and bravery, of course, of all the pilots and all of that. But the end result of the Dam Busters raid, apart from a few thousand deaths of forced labourers, many of whom were probably Polish, tragic in itself, but the end result is actually not very much. It doesn't achieve much. So it's a fascinating story. Yes, okay. It doesn't achieve much in the grand scheme of things. And yet, if you go down to your nearest bookshop and you look at the history section, you're bound to find a book about the Dam Busters raid because it's such a big thing for British historiography, right? And this is one of those sort of things that I can't really abide. I mean, fair enough, it's an interesting story, but it doesn't help us understand what's going on in the war, in the wider story. It doesn't help us understand, as I said, a period of 2 years of strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, for example. So what I want to do in my books is always to either take a familiar story and kind of turn it on its head and analyze it from a different perspective, which is what I did with Berlin at War, for example, or look for subjects that are very significant but have been ignored traditionally for various reasons. And that's why Polish history is, for me, is such a rich sort of hunting ground, because there's so much there that is massively significant and is barely present in the Western narrative. So my last, or more or less my last two books, so Devil's Alliance was in 2014 on the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and then First to Fight, which you very kindly mentioned, on the September campaign of 1939 is another one. So those two subjects, I think, are well overdue that they be properly understood and properly integrated into that sort of Western narrative of the war. And I'm doing my best to achieve that. It's a slow process, but I'm doing my best.
Well, it's really appreciated, and I think what the effect it has on my generation who were born here, whose parents experienced what actually really happened during the Second World War for Poles, is a terrific sadness and feeling of injustice. And I feel that by somebody like you taking it, bringing it to an English-speaking audience, you're actually helping me understand the kind of the atmosphere that I was brought up in, which was a feeling of injustice, a feeling of sadness and loss, not being understood, almost feeling that what we went through as a nation was in vain.
Yes.
And I think certainly for my generation, speaking to people like me born here, that's the feeling that we had, and we feel that these books and really, your work on these books is a tremendous kind of liberation, and we can understand it better as well because it's given a context so we can understand what it was our parents felt so sad about.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and it is for me it's very important, I think, because Poland itself, if you like, has been very kind to me. All of my books have been published in Polish. I've always been very made welcome in Poland, and as you saw, they were kind enough to give me a medal a couple of years ago, which is one of my rather pathetic but nonetheless one of my little life ambitions met. So that was a wonderful thing. Beyond that, there's Polonia, there's the Polish diaspora, much of which incidentally is directly related to the Nazi-Soviet Pact and the deportations to the Soviet interior and all of that, as you well know from your family story, right? And that has also been a very sort of favorable sort of atmosphere to work in, and as we're talking now, and through Ognisko and the Polish diaspora in London, also very enthusiastic, very supportive, absolutely, and I treasure that. I always think my sort of bottom line is actually trying, in a strange way, and as this kind of contradict you a little bit with that, but for me, my bottom line is almost to try and bring Polish history to a non-Polish audience.
Yeah.
Because I think to a large extent, you know, with Polish audiences and with Polonia audiences, Polish diaspora, you are sort of preaching to the choir to some extent, because they do understand it. They do know what you're talking about. They have personal experience or familial experience of what you're writing about. But for me, and I understand why, you know, from what you said, why that's significant, that it should have a resonance. But for the non-Polish audience beyond that, there you have people who've never even really considered Poland and Polish history, never even given it a second thought, and to try and bring them into the fold and show them that this is important and this is significant to the wider story, and they really should be interested in it. You know, I think that's, I find, you know, a really significant sort of part of what I'm doing. I had a lovely email, actually. I've just mentioned a chap from America. The First to Fight came out in America as Poland 1939, different title, but the same book. And I had a lovely email out of the blue from a chap over there who said, you know, he was of Polish extraction, but he didn't speak Polish, he didn't feel Polish, he said, and he'd never even given his Polishness a second thought. It was just a sort of a family thing. And then he picked up my book and he read it, and he said at the end, and I actually get a little bit emotional, but he said at the end, I've never felt prouder to be Polish. Like it's almost like it converted him to suddenly being a Pole, which I thought was wonderful.
That is wonderful.
In a sense, it's sort of those people. You want to bring those people in and say, look, this is a really fascinating, this is really significant history. You know, you really need to know about it, not because you're Polish, but because you're a human being. You know? Absolutely.
And you know, that was you know, the whole driver with doing MyLondyn is this is my way of saying to Londoners, you know, we're part of London. We're invisible in many ways. You know, I've actually had people say to me, oh, you know, how do we know that you're any different from us? And this is how we're different. You know, we have a different history. We have a fantastic arts world, and we want to share that with you. You know, we want you to see it's important to share these things and to and to hear about this stuff.
Absolutely. Crucially so.
And I've actually got another comment from James. Full disclosure, I'm a Dam Busters fanboy, but you're absolutely right about the bewildering number of books.
I mean, it is a great story. It is a great story, but I'm just, you know, just wider significance, I would argue, not very much. And it's a kind of if I'm honest, talking to James really here, but if I'm honest, I see the Dam Busters as a bit of British navel gazing, I'm afraid. But there we are. Maybe that's me.
But it's, you know, on a Sunday afternoon, it's quite a good film to watch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, so I've got another question for you, which is my question. What's the importance of the Hitler-Stalin Pact on the events leading up to September 1939, the invasion of Poland? This was something I learned from your book about the Baltic states and the outbreak of war in Europe. This was something I really, really got from your book.
Yeah, I mean, the Nazi-Soviet Pact is absolutely crucial. You can't, and it signed, you know, a week before the outbreak of war, before the German invasion of Poland, and it signed on the 23rd of August 1939. And as I said, it basically secures Hitler's, how do we put this, sort of forward front. It secures Stalin on side with Hitler. So Hitler then knows that Stalin isn't going to intervene in a negative manner and sort of, you know, frustrate his invasion plans for Poland. So he invades safe in the knowledge that Stalin isn't going to do anything about it. And of course, the realities of logistics mean that nobody else can do much about it either. The British and the French, as we know, declare war on the 3rd of September, but logistics dictate they can't project their power to the Eastern Baltic. The only thing they can do is attack Germany in the West, which they spectacularly pretty much failed to do as well. So Hitler's acting, he knows, with his Nazi-Soviet Pact, he's acting with considerable impunity in attacking Poland. So it's hard to see World War II breaking out in the way that it does in Europe without the Nazi-Soviet Pact as the sort of essential precondition for that. As I've said before, the secret protocol to the pact, which is the crucial bit, the actual text of the pact is rather anodyne, is rather bland. It's just a sort of standard non-aggression pact. And there were lots of non-aggression pacts that were signed in the 1930s. It was very much, the sort of standard go-to sort of treaty formula of various countries. So there was a German-Polish non-aggression pact, for example, and there was also a Polish-Soviet non-aggression pact in this period. So the text of the pact is very sort of anodyne and standard. The crucial bit is in this secret protocol, which is the bit that the Soviets for a long time, denied the existence of. Even Molotov went to his death. And Molotov, being the Vyacheslav Molotov, was the Soviet foreign minister who actually signed the Nazi-Soviet pact. It's sometimes known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because of him and his German counterpart, Joachim von Ribbentrop. He went to his death. He lived to a remarkable old age. He died in 1986, believe it or not, Molotov.
Oh, really?
And he was interviewed in old age by a Soviet journalist. So this is kind of almost just presaging a little bit the period of glasnost and perestroika that Gorbachev brought in. But he was interviewed by a Soviet journalist, I think about 1983, shortly before he died. And they said, what about this story of the secret protocol? It's still officially denied by the Soviets at this point. He said, what about the secret protocol? Did that actually happen? Was that a real thing? And even then, Molotov said, no. He said, I was very close to these events. Of course, he signed it. I was very close to these events, and I can confirm that this is a lie. Right? And even that late in life, he's still denying the truth of history. And Stalin, post-war, I think 48, Stalin penned this a pamphlet which was called The Falsifiers of History, in which he accused the West of rewriting history because they basically said, well, we've got the text of the secret protocol, and it was published by the American State Department. And he writes this pamphlet accusing the West of falsifying history. So you can see this kind of, you can see these trends here of this sort of Soviet idea, and you can see it happening now as well with Putin's Russia. You can see this idea of this very conscious manipulation of history, saying that we're the only ones telling the truth. And oh, by the way, what we say today isn't the same as what we said yesterday because, times change. The necessities of propaganda change. Everyone else is a liar. It's this really blatant manipulation of news, of the facts, of the truth of history, and all of that is very much in evidence in this story as well. So in terms of, sorry, that was a bit of a digression, but we go back to the outbreak of the war. It's you can't imagine the war breaking out in the way that it does without the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And crucially, the secret protocol is what divides up Central Europe between Hitler and Stalin. So this consigns the Baltic states to Soviet control. So they're occupied and annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, for example, become Soviet republics, much against their own will. And of course, then also the Soviets invade Finland in 1940. Is another chapter of World War II that we in the West do not understand because it does not fit the standard narrative. It's an amazing story, by the way. It's known colloquially as the Winter War, and it's an astonishing story. You could see shades. I thought this when we saw that traffic jam, that armored traffic jam that was bearing down on Kiev. Remember, at the beginning of the war, we were told that there was this back in February, March, there was this sort of 40-mile tailback of Russian armor that was queued up to get into Kiev. And I remember talking with family and friends and people who were saying, "Oh God, that looks awful. That doesn't look good for Kiev." Once they all get going. And I thought at the time, they're not going to get going, because I thought this is exactly the same as the tactics used by the Finns in 1940. So they had this wonderful tactic of what they called the Motti, where they would you had the overwhelming, in terms of manpower, firepower, armor, everything. The Soviets were numerically superior in every single category against the Finns. The Finns basically had the weather, because the war started in November of 39. They had the weather and they had their own ingenuity. And what they used to do was sort of put an armored roadblock at the front of one of blocking one of these roads into Finland. And basically, you had to fight the first couple of tanks or armored vehicles, whatever it is that was in front of you. Everything else was just jammed up, and they couldn't get around you because of the trees and the snow. So they're just in a traffic jam, right? So this at a stroke, nullified the Soviets' numerical superiority. It was a brilliant piece of tactics. And then they would go through mainly at night, and they would send ski troops through, and they would just cut those armored columns into pieces. And it's an amazing story. It's incredible. As you will know, Jola, because I do a short passage on it in The Devil's Alliance, but it really deserves wider readership because it's an amazing story. Anyway, I'm digressing.
Well, I many years ago I had an au pair from Finland, and we travelled over to visit one summer, and I just realised I knew nothing about Finland and how it'd been occupied. And it was a real eye-opener. Again, a story that's not been told.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that in your book. I really enjoyed, it's like, right, okay, so this is what they were talking about. I just felt that sort of pieces of a jigsaw had started to come together, which once you open up this pact, you start going, that's why it happened.
Yeah.
That's why.
So it's nice to hear that. I mean, it's sort of like I say, that early phase of the war. I think in the Western narrative, we just completely don't understand it. I don't think we even misunderstand it. We just don't understand it. And Central Europe, we have a sort of traditional myopia about Central Europe anyway. In the West, right? This is the attitude that was expressed by Chamberlain in '38 at Munich in discussion on the Munich conference, where he talked about Czechoslovakia, as a faraway country of which we know nothing. And you could say the same thing. They thought the same thing about Poland in 1939. They thought the same thing about Finland in 1940. It was just somewhere over there between Germany and Russia. And we don't know much about it. We don't know what its history is. We don't know who lives there. And from a British perspective, most of the time we didn't really care either. And that's changed, obviously. There's a good number of decades intervening in between. But to some extent, I think that attitude still prevails, right? How many ordinary Brits, if you stopped them in the street, could name the three Baltic states on a map correctly? Not many at all.
No, so, but I hope that what's happening in Ukraine and people really are beginning to value the Ukraine and understand that actually Europe is Ukraine as well, and we are affected by what happens in Ukraine. And I think that's unique. I don't remember a time where we've had that feeling as strongly as...
I absolutely agree, and I think this is part of a much bigger shift that we're seeing with the Ukraine war. There's a shift in terms of I would argue, the political centre of gravity, and crucially, I would say the moral centre of gravity of Europe, as in the EU, has shifted eastward. Germany is busy sort of hesitating and prevaricating, while Poland is opening its doors to Ukrainian refugees, up to, at last count, 5 million, was it? Ukrainian refugees, which is an astonishing performance. The Baltic states, if you look at the contributors to Ukraine's defense, sort of on a by a GDP level, it's all the East European countries. It's the Baltic states, it's Finland, and it's Poland. They understand what's going on in Ukraine better than Western Europe does.
I think social media has had a really big part, because I was watching something, and I'm going to be really honest here, and I saw this, and it was a video where it was like before the invasion, after the invasion, and I was looking at people in their homes. So there was, the dads playing with the kids in the garden, and then there was a picture of their kitchen, and their kitchens looked just like ours, like modern, beautiful. The gardens just looked like ours, with a little pool and a trampoline, and the dad is like on his back, and the kids like painting faces. And I think that's what's been powerful about social media, is just we're able to think, oh, they look just like us. They have family relationships just like we do. And the dads are just like modern dads. I think that's been quite a big difference. I think I was certainly shocked when I was reading. I have to say, from the microcosm onwards, I began to look at Poland differently. I'd seen it through my parents and my parents' stories about, being in a farm, people were landowners. And I used to describe it as, well, Poland before the war, it was very medieval. And suddenly I'm hearing about nightclubs tango dancing
Mhm.
and the Berlin cafe culture in Warsaw. I I just was like, wow. And that's what I think your writing, Norma Davis' writing, has really done, is to kind of bring that kind of maybe old perception of what it was like into a kind of a much more modern and relevant age.
Yeah, no,
Mm.
that's as I say, it's good, very good to hear. I just sort of tell it as I see it. There's no agenda there beyond, my own fascination with the history. So I just kind of could try and bring that across and make it as interesting to the readers as possible. It's
Fantastic,
simple as that.
fantastic, and you do that. You do that, and you'll have the book talk. So anyone who's watching this live, there are still tickets available for the book talk. Not many, so get down to the ogniscol.org.uk/events website. But get the book. Get the book. It is fantastic. And just one quick question
Mm,
is the impact on 2022 of this. I mean, we've been talking, sort of
yeah.
generally about the war, but can you sort of, in a nutshell, why? How is this impacting us in 2022?
Well, on a number of levels. The first one being, you're sitting here in London with your cut glass English accent. You're the result, and you and many others like you are part of this, this forced Polish diaspora, which was a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact and the deportations of huge numbers, hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Poles deported to Siberia, who then the remainder of which get out, as we well know, via Persia and out into the world, and most of whom never go home. Right, so in a sense, one of the answers to that question is you sitting there in London with your English accent. There you go. So part of it is that diaspora. Of course, Poland's current frontiers are broadly, I mean, not exactly the same before the Green Ink Brigade right in, are broadly similar to what was decided between the Moscow and Berlin in 1939. In those two agreements, there are two agreements that determine Poland's, or not Poland's frontiers, but the division between them. And what the Soviets decide to take in 1939 from Poland, they keep, and they insist on keeping in 1944-45, when they're then negotiating with the Allies about the future of Poland. So, that's one frontier that is essentially the same as the one drawn up by Hitler and Stalin. And you can say the same thing even about Moldova, right? Moldova as a country is essentially the creation of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, because it's the old Romanian province of Bessarabia, which was taken by the Soviets as part of the pact, and then never given back. It was reincorporated back into the Soviet Union as an independent Republic of Moldova, minus a couple of bits down to the south, but essentially it's the same as Bessarabia. So you can see that even the modern map of 2022 has scars of the Nazi-Soviet Pact within it. And I think the last point to make before we go, to come right up to date with the Ukraine war, this is one of those, I think Russia and the Soviet Union before it, with few exceptions, I think I would hold up, bizarrely, someone like Yeltsin, I would hold up actually as a relatively positive example of a sort of Soviet or Russian leader. And he's just dismissed as a drunk in the Western narrative. But I think history will be kinder to him in the long term than it will to almost anybody else of that generation. But Russia and the Soviet Union did very well at convincing the outside world that they weren't rogue states, that they were actually, run along rational principles, that they were willing, that the rule of law prevailed, and all of this sort of standard stuff that we take for granted in the West. And it's very good at sort of projecting that image of normality. And there are a couple of times where I think we can see that the mask slipped. And one of them is the Nazi-Soviet Pact, where Stalin makes a deal with Hitler. He divides up Central Europe between the two of them. He invades Finland. He invades Poland in 1939. He invades and occupies the Baltic states and invades Bessarabia. So this is a moment when the mask slipped, right? And I think you see another moment that when the mask slipped was in February of this year, 2022, when Putin, for a long time, who had been, committing these sort of piecemeal aggressions against his neighbors, saber rattling against the outside world, using gas and energy prices and all the rest of it as a lever to get what he wants, the mask slipped and he went for outright war against Ukraine. And I think these are the moments that sort of betray the grim, dark reality of how the Kremlin works. So we're seeing two of these moments, I think, one playing out at the moment and one in the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And I think that parallel is not overstated.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Roger. And it's been a real honour to meet you at last on this live stream. Thank you. I just remind everybody again, if you're watching this live, it's not too late to meet Roger at Ognisko Polskie Book Talk on the 28th November at 7 p.m.
September
even. September, thank you. I'm wishing my life away here.
Yes, exactly.
And if you're watching this video on YouTube, Roger's book is available in English. Details for the Polish and the US edition are in the comments below. So thank you again, Roger Moorhouse. Please like, comment and subscribe to #MyLondyn YouTube. Follow me on Twitter, #MyLondyn. And until next time, do miłego zobaczenia. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jola. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.